Good evening, everyone. My name is Jordana Mendelson. I direct Espacio Culturas. And on behalf of Maria Garde, our assistant director, and our whole team, we are thrilled to welcome you to Contesting Indigeneity, Connecting Peoples, a two-day symposium organized by Enrique Okenve, this semester's Andres Bello Chair at Espacio Culturas. For those of you who joined us for Professor Okenve's inaugural lecture in February, you're already familiar with the open-minded rigor and interdisciplinarity that he brings to his semester-long research into the impact of the Spanish Empire on Africa, Asia, and the Americas. His graduate seminar, Becoming Indigenous Under Spanish Rule, has brought these ideas into dialogue with the interests of his students, who throughout this evening will help us introduce our speakers, and we are grateful for them for their engaged participation. We want to thank our colleagues from across NYU who have helped us to bring Professor Okenve to campus, including the chair of the History Department, Guy Ortegano. Well, I think it's Ortelano. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm used to the double L, so trying to make everyone Spanish. Professors Robin Davignon and Leo Douglas, and from Hofstra, we are indebted to Benita San Pedro, who first put us in touch with Professor Okenve almost 2 years ago. We are also grateful to Professor Rebecca Getz, who is joining us this evening, and with Professor Okenve in moderating the discussion following the presentations. Stay on after the program for a reception in our atrium, when we can talk more informally about the rich and challenging array of ideas being shared with us today. And please return tomorrow when the program will continue with a discussion related to the events today, but also as a standalone, guided by some questions that Professor Okenve will be presenting for our speakers. Now it is my pleasure to hand the microphone over to Professor Enrique Okenve, who will introduce this evening's program, The Doing and Undoing of Domination Across the Spanish Empire. Thank you.
So, good evening. Thank you all for making it here today. As Jordana just mentioned, this is day one of our two-day symposium, Contesting Indigeneity, Connecting People. I was going to introduce myself like I am Enrique Okenve, but that was already said, so no need for that. I was also going to tell you I am the one on the poster outside. So just in case there was any doubt, not my idea, but as I said, given that I'm not a diva, I didn't tell anybody, no, you can't do that. I'll let them do it. So, and because of that, and because of all of this, because of we are here, I want to say a big, big thank you to the wonderful team here at Espacio de Culturas. They made this possible. They continue to make this possible. As I said, the event is going on right now and it will continue tomorrow. So big thank you to all of them. And also thank you also because they are making my stay here in New York a fantastic experience. It is 3 months now since I became fully immersed in this project. A challenging, perhaps ambitious, as a friend of mine in Jamaica said, but a very interesting. At this stage in my career, it's always very nice, very exciting to see that you can explore new things and feel the excitement about learning new things, and this is what in many ways this project is about. And let me tell you a little bit about it, so we can contextualize what the symposium of today and tomorrow is all about. At the start, the idea was to understand the creation of the category that we today know as indigenous, the one that the Spanish refer to as Indio in the historical context of the Spanish rule Americas and Philippines, or in the context of Africa, indigena. In the context, I'm thinking of Equatorial Guinea, which is the area I focus on, but also the context of the Spanish, the protectorate in Morocco. I was interested in how this category was key or became key to the development of a new form of power. That power that today we know as colonialism, because colonial power was characterized by the exclusionary nature of the relations of power that took place in every society. Any society, there is power and there are relations around that power and so on. But one of the things that came to characterize colonial power is exclusionary nature. In the context of the Americas first, later on Asia Pacific, the Philippines in particular, and much later the context of Africa, it consisted, or it was about the marginalization and the exclusion of indigenous people on the basis of their autochthony, just because they belong to that space, that because they had belonged to that space for centuries, if not millennia. That is basically what set them apart from the Iberian or the Spanish rulers. Key to this form of power and exclusion was also racialization, starting with the racialization of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. While this project and this symposium take the Spanish Empire as a historical framework of our analysis and discussion, there are at least two caveats that I have to share with you. One, the term Spanish Empire is, as some of you can imagine, is problematic, perhaps misleading also in the context of what we're doing here today and tomorrow. It suggests perhaps our focus lies on the Spanish rulers and their policies rather than the rule indigenous peoples, which is actually the focus of my visit here at Espacio Culturas and what we're doing today and tomorrow. Our invited speakers are going to be examining over the course of the next 2 days. Second, Spanish Empire has connotations of a particular vision of the past, a historical reconstruction that tends to elevate the ruling nation while belittling the peoples being ruled, the indigenous peoples. And I think I thought more about this last week because Jordana introduced to me as somebody who was looking, she was speaking Spanish and she said, Imperio Español. So I don't know why, when she said it in Spanish, it sounded like, no, I'm not doing that. Yeah, there is something that in your native language, I guess it means it has all these connotations that in a way I had not thought so much when you use the term in English, which is, to me seems a little bit more aseptic. But yeah, with Imperio Español, yeah, and coming from Spain and all the legacy of Francoism and all of that, it just sounded like, almost offensive in some ways, right? But as I said, the empire is just an excuse, it's a means to an end. What we want to do here is to explore the experiences of the indigenous peoples that were ruled, colonized by the Spanish, to compare their experiences and their responses across the different spaces that were ruled, or that Spain ruled, from the Caribbean to the mainland Americas to the Asia Pacific, especially the Philippines, but also Africa. That's sort of like epilogue of the Spanish Empire, almost accidentally arriving in Africa, so close to the Iberian Peninsula, but it's almost this kind of late arrival. At least for in the case of parts of Morocco and especially Equatorial Guinea. Of course, there are other areas of Africa, like the Canary Islands and Ceuta and Melilla, that were under the control of Spain from very early on. One of the key ideas that informs the original conception of this project is the notion of an acceptable power. Power is a concept that I borrow from Bruce Baker, the political scientist, in which I have used in my work on Equatorial Guinea and the Spanish colonial rule. This concept refers to the existence of accepted ideas of power and the accepted types of power relations that are characteristic of each society at any historical moment. The imposition of colonial rule, however, brought about the imposition of a new form of power and power relations that clash with those of the indigenous societies. Colonialism then became a primary example of the imposition of unacceptable power. As such, the concept of unacceptable power is helpful to understand the specific responses of indigenous people during the different stages of colonization and beyond. But understanding these responses, the actions and relations of so many peoples, communities, groups, and so forth, is a major undertaking. This is why this project was never conceived as an individual endeavor. This is why I'm so happy that Dana Velasco Murillo, Omar Badesi, Jorge Ulloa Hong, and Stephen Acabado are here with us over the next 2 days. In the past few months, I have learned so much from their work that it feels very special to have them here in the flesh. And I'm not exaggerating. I don't know if when I was going to say when you were a graduate student, some of you might be still a graduate student, but when I was a graduate student, I felt that excitement when you were reading people's books and then you came across, you met the person who wrote that book. I remember Terence Ranger, Jean Vancina, and I feel that excitement. So yesterday when I was thinking about this and preparing all of this, I felt that kind of excitement, which is nice because, you know, as you grow old, you don't get excited over so many things. And it was nice to feel like that again, right? Individually, their work looks at different historical moments and distant places and people. Together, however, their work can help us to compare the experiences of indigenous peoples from the Caribbean islands, Mexico, the Philippines, and Morocco, and see the ways in which their experience connect colonized indigenous peoples across time and space. Today and tomorrow, we should pay attention to contestation and resistance, how these two responses are narrowly linked to the specific experiences of indigenous men and also women, as we can see, or we will see in the work of Dana Velasco Murillo in her presentation. Colonialism also was not uniform, or it did not affect all indigenous peoples equally. There were instances in which indigenous communities were able to keep Spanish colonizers at bay, who resisted conquest, if you prefer. Right? And they were able, therefore, to maintain a very different relationship with colonized spaces, and that is something that we'll also be able to see in the presentation by Stephen Acabado and his work. Perhaps these varied resistances to colonialism explain the resurgence of indigeneity, even in places where indigenous peoples and their cultures were believed to have disappeared, or at the very least remain unseen, which is something that I think Jorge Ulloa also can speak to in his presentation, and something that I can actually confirm, you know, because as some of you know, I live and work in Jamaica, and that is part of that Caribbean space in which, like, the indigenous people seem to be non-visible, although they're almost like ghosts everywhere, right? If anything, from the experience of indigenous peoples in and outside the space and time of the Spanish Empire, we can learn that today's resistance of indigenous peoples is part of a long tradition. We should be able to see how the existence of indigenous peoples today attests to an enduring resistance that perhaps isn't so much associated with practical or material grievances, but with the desire to maintain and give preeminence to the culture and group identities of indigenous peoples, who in some cases have faced multiple assaults on their identities even before the Spanish arrived in the Americas. And I'm thinking in this case particularly Morocco, and we'll see. We can reflect on this during with Omar Bades's presentation on the experience of indigenous peoples in Spanish ruled Morocco. As I said, this is day one. Day two will be tomorrow. It will be a roundtable discussion, which we hope to be way or more interactive than this. But today we also will have space and time and space for discussion. So we're now going to listen to our guest speakers presenting. We'll then have a discussion, and please stay also for the Q&A, where you will be able to ask questions, make your comments, help us maybe to think things, or to see things a little bit different. And of course, we also have some refreshments after the event. So I hope you enjoy today's event, and I hope also to see you tomorrow. Thank you.
I want to introduce our first guest speaker, Dana Velasco. She's an associate professor of history at the University of California, San Diego. Her research centers on non-elite communities in colonial Mexico, especially indigenous people and women in the northern silver mining region. She is the author of Urban Indians in a Silver City and co-editor of multiple volumes on indigenous and African resistance in colonial Spanish America. Her current book project on the Chichimeca frontier has received major NEH and ACLS fellowships.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Enrique, and I want to thank all the departments, NYU, and you, the audience, for inviting me here to present some of my work here. This paper that I'm going to work on today is part of a book project, and thank you for the introduction, called Chichimeca Arc, War, Peace, and Resettlement in America's First Borderlands, 1546 to 1616. I'm looking to recover the history of the people who basically resisted a war against them by the Spanish. You can see here, I have a map up here. It's hard to see, but it's one of the few maps we have of the war in this period. So the overall Chichimeca War is a war of resistance against the Spanish state. And basically what happens here is this is the traditional territory of these Chichimeca peoples. Here in particular, these people are the ones I'm working on. I'll list them in a minute. And then you can see how these traditional territories, they're going to overlap in this area that's going to become the mining district, right? So you can see how these two worlds are going to collide, and the Spanish state is going to try to bring these people who are categorized under this ex-noem, Chichimeca, they're going to try to bring these people under colonial rule. And again, these are non-agriculturalists, they're nomadic people, some of them are semi-sedentary, and there's hundreds of groups. And in particular, my project looks at Zacatecos, Huachichiles, Tepehuanes, but I just want to highlight that there's many, many groups. And this is just to kind of give you the chronology of this arc that I'm talking about. This is an arc I've had to create for these people because there is no history that centers them. So there's a war from 1550 to 1587. There's what we call like a ceasefire from 1587 to 1591. And there's this period of consolidation where Chichimeca peoples come under Spanish rule. They reorganize themselves, and they actually get structured into like indigenous communities that we might think has like the first North American reservations. But this is just to give you an arc here. And then again, that image there is also from the war. Now, indigenous women and children were critical and valued members of Chichimeca societies. Yes, they have received very little scholarly attention. During the war, women and children were often taken into prize and sold into long-term contracts of personal service in legal contracts known as traspasos. Today, I want to consider how these women resisted personal service through flight, petitions for freedom, and negotiation of their labor terms. And ultimately, what I'm hoping to do today and for the book project is to show the impact of the war on women and the forced migration and displacement they endured, which I'm calling the Chichimeca diaspora, and the slave-like conditions they experienced, while also highlighting how individual and local constitutions of colonial rule offered some opportunities for indigenous agency. That is the ability to act in their own interest in some aspect of their daily lives. I just wanted to also, I can speak more about this in the Q&A. This is a very difficult project because these people are not very easy to find or well represented in the documents. We don't have any indigenous language records from these people. There is no central archive, and indeed, most of the archival material is very fragmented, and of course, it has these Spanish biases and agendas. Now, the Chichimeca War, I want to argue, was a war against indigenous women and children. And the archive offers ample evidence of raids that involve women if the records themselves do not provide us with many details. For example, in a 1576 traspaso, we get to recover some of the history of the indigenous Isabella. The record described Isabella as a Chichimeca Indian woman of the Alcalas nation of 25 years of age with markings, that is, tattoos on her face. Now, the ethnic Alcalas could have counted among the numerous bands of Pame and Tamalwipan Kekin-speaking nomads who lived to the north and west of the Panacu River. And that would be in this area right around here. So Isabel's probably coming from this area right around here. We just don't know for certain. We also don't know the exact circumstances of her captivity in early November of 1575, but it probably occurred not far from Panuco, because in that conflict, the Chichimeca War was particularly dramatic, and there was a lot of conflict in that period in that place. Now, personal service was thrust upon native peoples immediately upon their capture. The captain of a successful raiding party imprisoned, questioned, and then awarded the service of an indigenous captive, typically more than one, to a soldier. Each man, woman, and child then faced sentencing, which could occur within a day of capture or weeks later. Once captured, women, depending on their age, faced 8 to 20 years of personal service with removal to near or distant places. I have actually found a Chichimeca person who's ends up all the way in Lima. Now, under Spanish law in this period, Chichimeca people could not be sold. But the personal service of a captured individual, however, could be granted and transferred. And that's in this process of traspaso. Traspaso allowed for Chichimecas, through the proxy of their service, to be sold and relocated repeatedly, leading to a Chichimeca diaspora that was significant, widespread, and complex, involving multiple steps and location points. And we're going to look at one of these. We're going to look at how complicated it is just through one person. So Isabella's traspaso, who I just talked about, also contained what I'm calling the genealogy of the service history. That is the name of the previous owners and the transaction dates of earlier transfers. So, and I'm sorry, there is a bit of detail here, but it's just to give you the sense of this process. In 8 December 1575, the magistrate of the province of Panuco bestowed title to her service to the soldier Pedro de Herbite, about a month after her sentencing on the 2nd of November. On that very same day, he ceded his services to one Hernando de la Rea. Isabella, however, was not long in his service, for he transferred her personal service just 20 days later, on 28 December, to Captain Sebastian Perez. Thus far, Isabella had remained within the province of Pánuco. But soon enough, Perez marched her to Mexico City, most likely on foot, in what would have been a journey of weeks and hundreds of miles. Now, within a few months into the new year, on March 5th of 1576, Perez transferred Isabella's contract to Felipe Melendez of Mexico City. She remained in his custody until he sold her services about a month later, on the 11th of April, to one of the most influential officials in Mexico City. He was a high governing official, for 100 pesos. As of this moment, 12 years yet remained of her sentence. And as you can see, it's unlikely she remained in his household for that entire time. Yet some sort of hope remained for Isabel. If she could survive Mexico City and further traspasos, she could, in the late fall of 1587, at the age of 37, petition for her freedom. Isabel lived in a state of de facto slavery. The specificity of her terms of service was a legal formality, but it also offered the documentation of the end of service, a critical and built-in tool in the manumission process of Chichimeca peoples sentenced to years of forced labor. Okay, so on one hand, we have potential manumission, but what other strategies did Chichimeca women employ to resist the colonial state's appropriation of their freedom and labor? And I want to say that flight was always a possibility, with individuals absconding from their job sites. And here I just want to say really quickly, I'm going to tell you a bit about Maria Ramirez, and we can see here the document that details the information I'm about to give you. And I just want to give you a sense of, like, this is typically the kind of documentation I work with, both the horrible paleography, difficult paleography, and also just the fragmented nature of it. So the strategy of flight was not always successful, as many people found themselves returned to their masters, or on complaints of abuse, placed in the custody of a new contract holder. This was more or less the fate of the indigenous Maria Ramirez. On the 1st of September of 1586, we learned that Maria found her way to the city of Pátzcuaro. And that's going to be like somewhere in this area right here. It was actually at the time called Ciudad de Michoacán. And we don't know how long Maria was in the city before she came to the attention of the local authorities. Her declaration that, quote, she did not know who her masters were, end quote, led to her imprisonment for several days in the town's jail, while officials waited for Maria's master to come looking for her. But no news of or person arriving, the magistrate, Juan de la Torre, following mandates from the High Court of Mexico, ordered that slaves who did not know whom they belonged to were to be deposited with responsible and trustworthy individuals. In this case, he ordered that her services, that is her labor, be placed at the disposal of Father Francisco de Bustamante. And this was very common. The church held probably the largest custody of Chichimeca peoples. Now, while Maria ultimately returned to Spanish custody, I want to argue that her story is one of resistance, either in the fact that she represents all these people that escaped, either at the time of capture along the march to their new situation or once they were in the household of their masters. But also this other, and what I think is more probable going on here, I think she escaped later in her service when she had developed some fluency in either of the two major languages in Mexico at the time. That would have been Castilian or Nahuatl, the language of the people of central Mexico, when she had developed more fluency in sedentary ways and in the legal system. She traveled far from her service location, and perhaps she hoped to start a new life for herself in the anonymity of a new town. But I think Maria's testimony indicates, when she said she didn't know who her master was, that she understood she would be placed temporarily in a new situation, right? And that ultimately the inconsistency of her case, who is she, how did she get lost, might reach the viceroyalty, where she would be able to directly petition perhaps of an unfair or onerous burden in her first situation and then be placed in another one. Now, I want to, no, I'm going to stay here. So another example is a 1592 case of Maria Castaño, and this offers a more transparent example of how Chichimeca women employed the legal system to resist traspaso. Maria hailed from the greater Saltillo area, so that's up here. So you can see all these people are coming around this space here. This would have been the traditional lands of these non-sedentary people. While we do not know the exact location of her community, it was in an area that, according to viceregal decree, where presently no Indian Chichimecas were to be taken captive, so they were not to be taken in prize. From 1587 to early 1590s, a series of ceasefires in the Chichimeca War began to offer the appearance of a lasting truce. In their quest to maintain this really fragile peace, local and viceregal officials, particularly the latter, began to exercise more caution and moderation in the seizure and imposition of personal service on Chichimeca peoples. But native peoples were still being raided and forced in personal service. And, this was in direct contravention to the crown's order. Gaspar Castaño, for example, led a group of slave raiders that roamed the recently pacified areas, illegally capturing Chichimec peoples. Castaño and his raiding party were considered so dangerous to the peace that the viceroy sent a group of soldiers to apprehend him as the former made his way north towards New Mexico. Now, Velasco also enjoined the captain of the expedition, Juan Morlete, quote, to, quote, liberate the Chichimeca Indians that he had captured, end quote. Now, Maria was one of the Chichimecas caught in his raid. Despite the viceroy's decree, she was captured and taken into Zacatecas and forced into servitude. Maria petitioned for her freedom, declaring that she was, quote, a free person, not obligated to service or perpetrator of a crime that would give anyone cause to capture her, end quote. In February 1592, the then viceroy, Velasco, not a relation, instructed Morlete to restore Maria's freedom. Velasco ended his order with a strongly worded warning that, quote, neither the said captain or any other person make use of her for personal service, but rather to leave her in the said communities as a free person, end quote, quote, end quote. Aware of her rights, Maria used the court system to successfully escape traspaso. Many other Chichimecas across New Spain, claiming wrongful seizure and forced servitude, also used the petition process to secure their freedom. So obviously, I can't go into many examples, but I want to say a lot of these strategies I'm giving you, there's many more other cases in the archive. So I want to talk a bit now about this third strategy, and that's negotiation. Now, so traspaso allowed for the possibility that at some time a Chichimeca person could fulfill their bonds of service and reclaim their personal liberty. The following cases illustrate how two women negotiated the transition from service to freedom. Now, in July 1599 in Mexico City, a Chichimeca woman named Catalina appeared before the official Gaspar de Valdez. Catalina was native to the northern mining town of Masapil, and so Masapil you're going to see is right up here on that corner up there. Sorry, I should have brought a pointer, but if you remember that Maria Castaño was up there in Saltillo, Masapil is just there to the northwest. Now, the path that brought her to Mexico City is unknown, although it was certainly forced. According to the document, Catalina claimed to be under no compulsory personal service. She wished of her own free will to serve in the house of Juan de la Cruz. After he interrogated her, Valdez wrote to the viceroy, confirming Catalina's status and her intent to work for de la Cruz. The viceroy ordered Catalina to the custody of de la Cruz for 1 year or longer, has she so desired. The decree included the standard instructions to her master to Christianize her, provide her with food, and treat her illnesses. However, he also ordered that Catalina receive 2 pesos every month. A few months later, in October of 1599, a Chichimeca woman named Inez made a similar request to that of Catalina. She had been fulfilling her labor contract in the Mexico City household of a married couple, Miguel Hernandez and Maria Madalena de Miranda. On the completion of her obligatory personal service, Inez, now at liberty, requested to voluntarily remain with the couple because, quote, of the good treatment she had received from them, end quote. The viceroy acknowledged Catalina's status as a free individual and deposited her with the couple for 1 year with the exact conditions he had extorted from Catalina's masters: Christianization, food and clothing, and monthly wages. So we can only conjecture why Catalina and Inez, 2 women free of personal service obligations, according to their testimonies, as well as of those of colonial officials, decided to submit to further compulsory, albeit short, labor contracts. For Catalina, perhaps she had completed her original service contract in Mexico City or had been deposited there as a child. And that's actually what I think is going on here. I think these 2 women both came as children and sought to remain in the capital. Who knows how long she'd been away from Masapil? Not only was the site quite far from Mexico City, but the chances that she had any social networks or personal ties in the northern mining zone were small, if non-existent. While we have no idea of Inez's place of origin, she too might have found herself in similar circumstances. The document describes her as 40 years of age, with many shaped stripes on her face. These facial markings were a rite of passage common to Chichimeca society, indicating that Inez was taken a raid in the northern mining district as a young adult and potentially served a 20-year sentence of forced labor. As with Catalina, there likely would have been little to return to in her territorial homeland. The Chichimeca diaspora, like those of other forcibly displaced people, also occasioned a type of social death. Catalina and Inez's patron ties and social support now existed among the people and places of the vice-regal capital. Catalina might have worked for De la Cruz in the past or labored for a municipal resident in the neighborhood. One can imagine that Catalina had negotiated her work routine and daily living conditions with De la Cruz before she requested the contract, leaving her with a certain confidence that the work environment was bearable and that he would treat her well. Familiarity with her master certainly played a role in Inez's decision to continue in their employment. The arrangement was not unusual. Scholars have documented other cases where women sold themselves or their services because they saw it as the best option for survival and autonomy within harsh and exploitive colonial systems. After all, by entering into these labor arrangements, Catalina and Inez obtained a certain security for themselves during a transitional period. The viceroy's decree had made it clear that no individual or legal process could disturb or remove either of them, and that there would be no more selling or transfers of their service. Catalina and Inez had liberated themselves from the threat of traspaso. So I just want to say in conclusion here that captured Chichimeca people were among the most exploited groups in the viceroyalty. And I think we know the least about them, honestly. They often lack communal networks and legal recourses to defend themselves. Within this coercive system, the odds were high that they fell victims to abuse and corruption that kept them performing forced labor for longer than their sentences. Despite this exploitative context, this presentation has highlighted strategies of resistance, including flight, petitions, negotiation, and demanding that their built-in emancipation be honored. I'm very open to questions about more of what's going on here, and I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Omar Badesi. His research lies at the intersection of Hispano-Moroccan relationships, with a focus on the medical mission of Spanish colonialism in Morocco. He explores how medical discourse portrayed North Africans as degenerate and curable, examining the roles of Spanish physicians and nurses as colonial agents who used medical and Christian discourse to legitimize colonialism. Through his research, Omar aims to advance dialogue and reshape narratives around colonialism's lasting impact on minority groups today, particularly the native Amazigh communities in North Morocco. Please join me in warmly welcoming Omar Badesi.
Okay, hello everyone. First of all, I wanted to thank you, Enrique, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and have a conversation also with Jorge, with Stefan, with Dana, and everyone else, and also inspire me a little bit to further investigate the indigenous communities in North Morocco in particular. And I'm very happy because this research also preparing me for this summer trip. I'm planning to go to Rabat to also investigate about the French administration in particular and how they were also talking and writing about the Moroccan indigenous groups from a different perspective and narrative. So my presentation today, I'm going to be focusing on three periods of history, also in Morocco, 19th century, the first Hispano-Moroccan War, and the second phase, which is the Rif War, also in North Morocco, and also the last period, which is in the 50s. It's the movement of independence in Morocco. So just to give you an idea about North Morocco on the map and the Spanish influence, I wanted to share with you this map. So as a starting point, the first Hispano-Moroccan War happened in 1859, 1860. And what's interested to me is how the reaction of the native population was vis-a-vis the Spanish penetration to the city. So the reaction of the population of Tetuan to the arrival of the Spanish troops during the Hispano-Moroccan War constitute a key form of contestation to colonial order, even though it didn't take the form of a direct confrontation. Shortly before the occupation, a significant portion of the population fled the city. Those who remained engaged in less visible yet equally meaningful forms of resistance. According to the chronicle Abdullah Afailal, the surrender was experienced with deep bitterness by the Moroccan Muslim population, which translated into an attitude of withdrawal toward the invader. And this is Bab al-Oqla, one of the most famous gates to the old Medina in Tetuan. So Tetuan was like a fortress, and so the Spanish troops entered and penetrated through one of those main gates. It has 7 gates, and this is one of the gates called Bab al-Oqla. And this is just a picture to make you see the real image. In his work, La Campaña de Marruecos, Spanish military doctor Nicasio Landa captures this gesture with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment, describing the inhabitants of Tetuan as motionless figures. I quote, "On their serene and immutable faces, there was not the slightest sign of surprise, silent like so many statues of fatalism." It was written, or in Arabic it was maktub. This resignation points to a form of conscious withdrawal. As Goicolea Aimiano suggests, it can be understood as inkimash, a form of internal immigration toward oneself. An inward retreat that preserves religious and social integrity in the face of colonial intrusion. Similarly, other Spanish authors describe this behavior of the Tetuani population as eloquent, silent, emphasizing the skull on their faces and a dignity worthy of consideration and respect. This distance was not only emotional or spiritual, but also political. As de Madriaga observes, many Moroccans did not recognize the Spanish as legitimate bearers of civilization missions in Morocco. Quote, "They are not, the Spaniards, qualified to give them lessons in civilization," unquote. Faced with these non-confrontational forms of resistance, Spanish observers themselves reveal inconsistencies in their discourses. Both Landa and Chronicle Pedro Antonio de Alarcón, who also participated in the war, acknowledge at different moments the limit of the colonial enterprise. Alarcón even admits the impossibility of subduing the people of Tetuan and recognizes their resistance as a form of collective duty drawn reveal in parallel. Quote, "The Moors' attitude with regard to the Spanish invasion is the same that we adopted toward the French invasion," and he's referring to the Napoleon invasion to Madrid. In Landa, this tension appears as an emerging empathy that contrasts with more denigrating discourses. He describes the combatant as victim of military honor and observes how the bodies of both sides, Moroccans and Spaniards, lie together united in the cold embrace of death. During the occupation, this ambivalence intensified between being humanist and also being aggressive toward the enemy. Goicolea describes this process as a form of colonial mimesis, in which the Spanish began to adjust their attitude and implicitly recognized legitimacy of certain local demands. Rather than consolidating a one-directional domination, Spanish colonial presence depended on constant negotiation with Moroccan population. Local actors, including diplomat of the Makhzen, which is the Moroccan governing institution back then before the 50s, skillfully exploited these tensions through discursive and political strategies. They questioned Spain's legitimacy as a civilizing power by pointing to its marginal position within Europe, and they mobilized the specter of internal instability, including the threat of dynastic conflict inside Morocco and the fear of an internal civil war, to shape colonial intervention. Finally, Landa attempts to reorganize this complexity through a selective distinction between type of Moors or native or Moroccans. Those considered docile or dociles or mansos or peaceful Moors are presented as subjects capable of regeneration and potential allies of the Spanish project. These operations confirms the flexible and strategic nature of the category of the native used to justify both domination and collaboration. However, the responses of the people of Tetuan, from exodus to spiritual withdrawal, survival, pragmatism, and political negotiation, show that even without resorting to open violence, colonial subjects were able to challenge, limit, and reshape the conditions of colonial power. And I wanted to share with you some pictures from the epoch and also from the context that articulates this complex and contradictory dynamics of El Moro Amigo, El Moro Enemigo, the Moor who is like collaborate with the Spanish projects, or the colonials, or the Moor who is a savage who will resist. So it was this kind of also wishful thinking of some authors, colonial observers, and chronicles, who also expressed openly their desire that some of those Moroccans were to be Christianized, for example, all right? Or some of them, they have this potential or this capacity of being regenerated. But the others who resist, for example, the colonial agenda are doomed to be like degenerate, or, for example, a lost case in this case, right? And here's one of the sentences from Nicasio Landa's work, and you can see how he's expressing his desire that some of those Moroccans who joined him, or those who he met during his time in Tetuan, he wishes that they could like belong or join the Spanish troops. Here are also some documents that I want to share with you that document this dynamic from Spanish institutions and the play of systems of reward, systems of punishment to those Moroccans who collaborate and those who are not. And this is being even organized from higher institutions to push that type of policy, right? To recruit or to punish in this case, those who resist. You can also see more pictures of that hybrid image of the Moroccan who is sometimes pro-Spain, sometimes against Spain. Sometimes he can be seen as an hypocrite, or sometimes just a pure pragmatism, or you can never, for example, trust the other, and this interesting dynamics of contradictions. So if in Tetuan indigenous contestation took the form of evasion and withdrawal, the RIF War 1921-1926 marks a shift toward open confrontation and explicit assertion of sovereignty. The figure of Abd al-Karim al-Khattabi, he's one of the leaders of the RIF resistance, embodies this turning point. His leadership not only challenged Spanish rule, but also destabilized the colonial categories that sustained that power. This case acquires particular significance when examined through the contemporary television series Tiempos de Guerra, set during the context of disaster of Anwar. More than an historical reconstruction, the series functions as a site of the production of memory and the rearticulation of the national imaginary. As Paul Julian Smith has argued in Dramatized Societies, quote, television has displaced cinema as the creative medium that shaped the national narrative. In this sense, Tiempos de Guerra not only represent the RIF War, but also contribute to shaping the contemporary structure of feeling towards the colonial enemy, and in particular toward indigenous figures such as Abd al-Karim al-Khattabi and other characters like Larbi, Abdullah, and others, which I will be happy to circle back during the discussion. In the series, Abd al-Karim is marked by a fundamental ambivalence. He is recognized as a charismatic and effective leader, yet also represented as a radical threat. And this is the representation of Abd al-Karim in the series Tiempo de Guerra. His command of Spanish, his education in both Moroccan and Spanish institutions, and his participation in the colonial administration exceed this stereotypical illiterate Moor. This hybridity renders him eligible within colonial categories and exposes their contingency. The shift from friendly Moor to indomitable or savage enemy reveals that the indigenous doesn't designate a sense, but a political position that changes according to imperial interests. And it's a funny observation that during these scenes, the Moroccan characters, Abd al-Karim, Abdullah, or his workers, or the ones under his leadership, they don't speak Moroccan Arabic, but they speak Levantine Arabic, as if there is no one specialty in Moroccan dialects. And curiously enough, I googled the German version of Tiempos de Guerra, and it was a different Arabic as well. No single actor was being able to speak at least Northern Moroccan or Amazigh, the native language of the north. It's just a funny story. However, the series resolves this tension through a narrative that displaces responsibility for the conflict onto Abd al-Karim. His elimination is framed as a necessary act of saving lives, while Spanish violence is presented as defensive or even humanitarian. In this way, RIF resistance is depoliticized and reduced to a irrational threat, while colonial intervention is legitimized through scenes of ethical posturing. This operation forms part of a broader pattern in which Spanish colonial production about its colonial past becomes a space where a normalized national and unequivocal European identity is negotiated, projecting into the present an idealized and justificatory image of imperial history. In parallel with the image that this series is trying to portray about a shaped or a constructed version of history, the document from the archival research that I found, for example, in this is the timeline, by the way, from the official website of Tiempos de Guerra. They portrayed the resistance of Abd al-Karim Khattabi as a threat to the European body in general, or as a treason to Europe, as if Spain back then was like solidly European, but also to put the whole responsibility of the RIF War onto one person. And this is also illustrates the dynamics of the penetración pacífica, which means like peaceful penetration back then during the RIF War period. So the goal was like to penetrate in Morocco and to gain the trust of Moroccan leaders through peaceful acts of colonialism. But there is a lot of things to say about that, and also the history shows different facts, like the many documents from military institutions that shows the bombardment on that region of North Africa, especially Rif Mountains, and the substances, the toxic gas mostaza that they were using to bombard all those regions as a way of punishment. And these are some documents from military archives. And you can see in the pictures also the types of bombs and the regions. Some of them even mention the houses of some leaders that these bombs were thrown upon to. In contrast, Abdelkrim's historical trajectory points in a different direction. Far from representing an absolute exteriority to the colonial system, his education, administrative experience, international networking, and command of imperial legal and political languages enables him to appropriate and re-articulate those very tools in order to advance a sovereign project. In this sense, his leadership not only challenged colonial power, but also subverts the framework that defines the indigenous as subordinates. The Rif War can thus be understood as a moment in which colonized subjects not only resist, but actively intervene in redefining their political and legal status. And this is one of the letters that Abdelkrim himself wrote to the Swedish prince to ask for cooperation within the Red Cross frame. To close, in the Rif War, if the Rif War marks an assertion of sovereignty against colonial power, the period from the 1930s to 1950s introduces a shift toward more complex forms of contestation, grounded in the intellectual, institutional, and discursive appropriation of the colonial system itself. The figure of Shakib Arsalan situates this process on a trans-regional scale. A proponent of pan-Islamism and pan-Maghribism, Arsalan articulates a critique of European imperialism that combined religious history, politics, and advancing the idea of an Islamic unity capable of countering colonial fragmentation. In the Moroccan context, his intervention was decisive. His critique of the Berber Dahir, which is like a French set of rules that aims to highlight Amazigh culture and rules, but some nationalists saw it as a way of fragmentation of the Moroccan society from within. So he criticized this Dahir that the French used to use. So his critics reveals how colonial categories functioned as instruments of division, separating Amazigh and Arab population along legal, linguistic, and religious lines. In response, Arsalan proposed a reinterpretation of the past that exceeded such classifications. His emphasis on Al-Andalus, not only as a lost past, o paraíso perdido, or al-bustan al-mafquda, or al-janna al-mafquda, but as a living continuity, allowed him to reconfigure Morocco's position from a subordinated native to the legitimate hire of a globally significant Islamic civilization. As Calderwood notes, these moves engage within Spanish colonial discourse, which also invoked Al-Andalus. However, Arsalan reverses its logic by relocating historical authority to the Islamic world. This project cannot be understood apart from the social conditions that made it possible. Unlike earlier forms of resistance, these strategies were mediated by literate elites embedded in transnational networks and in many cases within the institution of the protectorate itself. This class dimension is crucial. It enabled these actors to mobilize the legal, historical, and political languages of colonialism in order to intervene from within. Contestation in this case, or in this sense, no longer simply rejects the system, but actively reconfigures it. Arsalan's influence continued in a generation of Moroccan nationalists such as Abdelkhalak Torres, Mohammed Daoud, Ben Nouna, Gennoun, Aziman, and Bin Taoud, among others. These figures developed strategies that combined political opposition, intellectual production, and institutional participation. Torres, for instance, built nationalist networks that extended beyond the colonial sphere, drawing the constant surveillance of colonial authorities. His activity illustrates how contestation expanded into international circuits, exceeding the limits of colonial control. At the discursive level, figures such as Dawood and Bennouna carried out systematic reappropriation of the Andalusi imagery. Against the colonial narrative of the lost paradise, they redefined Al-Andalus as a living legacy whose continuity was embodied in Morocco, especially Tetouan in the north. This move not only inverted the colonial narrative but also destabilized the category of the native. By asserting a historical genealogy linking Iberia and Morocco, these authors positioned themselves as central historical subject rather than subordinate population. Culture, including the revival of Andalusi music, thus became a key site of contestation and national legitimation. I'm going to skip a little bit for the sake of time, but overall these dynamics reveals a more ambiguous relationship with colonial power. As Calder would suggest, a form of codependence emerged. While Spanish colonialism relied on narratives such as Al-Andalus, Hispano-Moroccan brotherhood, Al-Andalus use of past shared history, narratives such Al-Andalus and this kind of making the past legitimate, Moroccan nationalists also reappropriated those same narratives to construct an autonomous identity and thus deconstructing colonialism from within using the same tools. Taken together, these trajectories show that indigenous contestation in this period operated through appropriation, negotiation, and subversion of colonial frameworks. This category of the native ceased to function as unilateral instrument of domination and instead become a site of struggle where local actors redefined their legal, historical, and political positions. The transition from the Reef War to the nationalist movements thus represent not only rupture, but a transformation from direct confrontation to struggle over the control of language, institution, and memory. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful speech. Now I want to introduce Professor Jorge Ule Hong. He holds a PhD in archaeology from Leiden University and was a postdoctoral researcher on the ERC Synergy Project, Nexus 1492, New World Encounters in a Globalizing World. His interdisciplinary research integrates archaeological, ethno-historical, and social-cultural approaches to examine material cultures, landscapes, and indigenous cultural presence in the Caribbean, particularly in Hispaniola and Cuba. He has held research and curatorial position at the Technological Institute of Santo Domingo and the Museo de Ombale Dominicano, and currently serves as lecturer in the anthropology department at the University of Miami and senior editor of the open access journal Ciencia y Sociedad, which means science and society in Spanish. Let's welcome him to do the speech.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to say thank you again to Enrique and his team for this invitation. It's a pleasure for me to share with you some results of my research on the last 10 years. And also this presentation is a kind of abstract of two books we published in the 2016 and 2018 in collaboration with another college on Nexus 1492. My presentation is some kind of connection between historical and evidence and also archaeological evidence to highlight indigenous strategy for adapting, resisting colonization, and also this presentation considered the agency of colonizers and colonized through social and material changes. In 1492, the Caribbean was populated by the plurality of indigenous community whose ancestor has been dated around 6,000 years before present. It was a place of social network and interaction with mobility of objects, people, ideas, and belief. These networks were modified or interacted to serve a Spanish colonial purpose and were the foundation of the Colombian exchange. The last one was the initial strategy of the Spanish colonialists and revealed the use of the indigenous knowledge alongside the Portuguese colonial's model of feitoria or factoria. The rescates of exchange mediated the relationship between the Spaniards and indigenous people. European material culture was exchanged to obtain information, create alliance, gain influence, or acquire gold. The indigenous people manipulate this exchange, offering wife, object, and knowledge. This initial interaction and cosmogonic and practical dimension, and the indigenous consider the European presence and materiality in the life of exoticism and unrepresented and remote character. This contact situation were characterized by sporadic bonds and limited coexistence between European and indigenous people, laying the foundation for the Spaniard colonial program. In the Caribbean, this involved different speak and temporalities. As part of the Feitoria strategy, an initial extractive colonial route was established a connection with colonial route, extractive colonial route was established to connect the interior of Hispaniola, the Cibao region, with the first European town, La Isabela, founded on the island northern coast and some kind of outlet to the Atlantic Ocean. This was the first experience in forming a subsequent network of coastal towns that served as a waypoint and connection between different parts of the Spanish Empire and the metropolis. Archaeological studies conducted along the colonial route revealed high indigenous population and density and demonstrate cultural diversity expressed through material cultural style. The location of indigenous settlement provide evidence of networks of social interaction that connect communities across diverse environmental landscape and social interconnected region. The relevance of the indigenous social network in the formation of the colonial road is illustrated in the Memorial of Columbus sent to the Crown, conocido Memorial de Torres, which include observation or on distance between places and requests for animals, tools, and weapons. The formulation of the extractive road in 1494 entitled the creation of line of fortress of military control, tax collection, and the exploitation of mining and clay, also impelling the first repartimientos or distribution of indigenous community of indigenous labor among colonizers. Archaeological and paleoecological evidence revealed the transformation of the landscape associated with the formalization of the colonial road as a extractive corridor and a strategic connection. The transmission from the pre-colonial landscape characterized by forests and small-scale subsistence agriculture to open space resulting from deforestation and the introduction of European fauna and botanical species. Evidence of environmental degradation also show how the initial road was subsequently transformed and adapted by the activities typical of the island's successive colonial economic cycles. The creation of the first colonial road also stimulated the adoption of other forms of control and domination over the indigenous population, marking the transition to situation of encounters to colonial situation of domination, characterized by the administrative centralization, the creation of the Spanish town, and some of them associated with the former fortress, like Concepción de la Vega, Santiago de los Caballeros, or gold extraction zone like Cotuí and La Buenaventura, and the imposition of the encomienda system. The transformation to colonial situation also transformed the interaction between the Spanish and indigenous people. The indigenous autonomy and negotiation capacity within their own social structure were limited, generating multiple responses, including reorganization and the emergence of new identities. The transformation to a colonial situation is diverse across the Caribbean island. It evolved as the Spanish became more familiar with the local population and their customs, and more confident in the Antillean natural environment. In Cuba, material associated with the chains of gifting are less. Indigenous sites show weapons, tools, and objects related to a question and more common. In general, these objects do not integrate into the indigenous ceremonial universe and point to the Spanish colonial agency. The initial bond with indigenous people was established more rapidly and from a position of domination, and the characteristics of European material culture are associated with the functionality in a colonial context for extracting gold and other resources through the intensive labor. The analysis of the transition to a colonial situation in the Caribbean revealed a combination of three essential elements. First, the use of what Gosden have defined as terra nullius model, based on minimal recognition of indigenous population, way of life, disrupt of their society through the land appropriation. The original inhabitants were displaced or concentrated temporarily or permanently, losing both their physical foundation and spiritual connection to their land and ancestors. The legal principle of land appropriation ran parallel to the colonial description of places, of commercial valuable animals and plant species, the renaming of geographical location, the production of map, the appropriation of indigenous knowledge, and the extensive transformation of the landscape. Second, the adaptation of feudally oriented institutions such as repartimientos and encomienda to exploit the inhabitants of those landscapes. In the Caribbean, encomiendas served as an instrument to reconcile or to provide a reconciliation of the moral obligation of evangelization, the crown debt to the conquistadors, and the crown economic and expansionist interest through the confluences of economic, juridical, and religious factors. Given the absence of the literary written revelation tradition among the indigenous population, evangelization was reconfigured and the criteria applied during the Reconquista War. Through the encomienda imposed in 1503 in Hispaniola, in 1509 in Puerto Rico, and in 1513 and 1515 in Cuba and Jamaica, indigenous people were compelled to servitude in exchange for Christian and civilized instruction. In a sense, allowed for the use of labor from population whose enslavement could not be legally or ideologically justified. Archaeological investigation conducted by Roberto Valcárcel at the encomienda site of El Chorro de Maíta in Cuba revealed the remains of 133 individuals, most of them local origin, with others from other Caribbean regions, including one from Mesoamerican origin and another of African origin, additionally individuals of mixed European and indigenous or European and African ancestry. Key findings including burials, objects, individuals inhumated in Christian position, and with abandon of cranial modification. Cranial modification was an authentic ethnic marker inside of the indigenous population, whose taphonomic analysis indicate burials with clothing. The site reveals blend of rituals that reflect both resistance to and acceptance to the new practice, illustrating evolving identity shaped by the colonial influence and by ethnic and cultural mixing resulting from adjustment to the colonial situation. And related with the two comments I made before, is the search factor was the colonial stigmatization of the indigenous population. Colonial rules stigmatize indigenous people, combining local labels, Arawaks, Naborias, Waitiaos, Lucayan, Caric, alongside the homogenizing category of Indios. This logic was replicated on colonial map and facilitated the indigenous slave trade. For example, the lack of resources of certain islands led to the declaration of Islas Inútiles, allowing the capture of their inhabitants for enslavement and conversion into lifetime servants, Naborias. Those who could legally be enslaved included the people from Carib Island, okay, the Spaniard mentioned these people like cannibal, authorized it in 1403. Those captured in confrontation with the Spanish opposing for the faith, just the Spanish mentioned or considered this opposition to this colonizer or this colonization campaign like a just war, and those who already have slave status among the indigenous people. This trade was legally presented at the Just Act through the evangelization and save for the reason of salvation. In that case, the Spartan mentioned or considered this kind of right like armadas de rescate. Hispaniola was the main hub for slaving and trafficking of indigenous people in the Caribbean, with Puerto Rico with focus on the Eastern Caribbean and Cuba on regions like Florida and Central America. Margarita, Coche, and Cubagua Island near to Venezuela supported pearl fishing and served as central point in the slave trade to the Great Antilles. Between 1493 and 1552, an estimated 25,000 to 500 indigenous people were trafficked through the Caribbean or through the circum-Caribbean region. Ceramics suggests the mobility and coexistence of the indigenous people of diverse origin and status in colonial settings such as La Vega. This is a picture of ceramic of different indigenous people in colonial place like La Vega in Hispaniola. Mechanisms of indigenous resistance were dynamic phenomena. From 1492 included allies or alliances, confrontation, attrition tactic, and insurrection, often with action against the Spanish enclave and rebellion over tribute or forced labor. Between 1505 and 1518, the resistance to military superiority of epidemic and social disintegration favored the unconventional tactics, such as the destruction of crops, flight into the inaccessible terrain, and suicide as rejection of servitude. A particular notable example with these features is through the materiality character. For example, in the case of Cotuí, this ceramic came from Cotuí, and this is Enriquillo. Enriquillo was one of the most important leaders in Hispaniola rebellion, and also the Spaniard in 1563 they need to negotiate with him in exchange of lands and other prevents. It's necessary to add the mechanism of cultural adaptation and resistance. A study of indigenous ceramic production and 16th century mining camp of Cotuí show how the indigenous technology were selected, adopted, and modified in response to colonial conditions. Of autochthonous technology shaped the dynamic of cultural transmission and cultural resilience. This is an example. For example, this is ceramic they found in the gold miner camp in Cotuí, and you can see this is Indian living, under colonial situation, and you can see the reduction of many, because the Spaniard prohibited, the reproduction of many of these, cosmological elements through the ceramic. And also you can see how, despite of this reduction, they try to select some element to show through the ceramic. The legal finish of La Encomienda system in 1542 opened a new chapter for the indigenous people to contend with the colonial administration, strategy, and find mode to survival. Colonial governments imposed the new law of Indias, Nuevas Leyes de India, tended to concentrate the people, who survived the encomienda in this new form of tutelaje or new form of domination, pueblos de indios, or Indian village. You have here in the map, basically in the sample of Cuba, the Spanish town, all these pueblos de indios was connected or related near to a Spanish town. Could be the most famous was El Caney, and also in the case of Havana, Guanabacoa. In some cases, the Spaniard also incorporate, all these remains of population in this Indian town, but also the indigenous people had the option in some cases to try to use another form of survive. From the mid-16th century to the 18th century, Indians were present in all towns of the Spanish Caribbean, appearing as farmers, ranchers, and workers. Farmers and workers and diverse trades supplying material elements, for example, to the case of, this is an example how, for example, indigenous people survive in the case of Havana, people from Guanabacoa supply, for example, this is materiality connected with the old Havana in the 18th and 19th century, also related with indigenous or the surviving of the indigenous people. One important thing that many indigenous people also was incorporated to inside or to the battalions, or many of the battalions, or the defense of Spaniard troops is basically they work in the construction of fortress and other thing. And also you can see here, this is really interesting case. This is the case of Higuaní in the eastern part of Cuba, because this case is a form of how the indigenous people also manipulate or use the judicial law of the Spaniard in this moment, and also create this town not under the supervision of officials, also for himself, basically for the initiative of one people, one leader, indigenous leader. In this case, it's a kind of, collective strategy. And this is, like Enrique mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, one of the most important things that the coloniality in the case of the Caribbean have is the idea of the proclamation of the indigenous extinction. This is a picture of how the indigenous tradition, how the indigenous knowledge also continued in many islands. This picture came from Cuba, basically from the eastern part of Cuba, and this map is for the beginning of 20th century. And this is another strategy that the indigenous people use, the mixed matrimony, especially, you can see here, this picture came from the beginning of 20th century, and also this is traditional that we have today. Also here you have some pictures, how, for example, we continue in many popular culture in many regions of the Caribbean, we continue with, with this knowledge and tradition present right now, despite the idea of the extinction of this population and also the contribution to the heritage and also to the national culture. This is an example with Española. We have, for example, how in the countryside in Española, the people continue fishing with the traditional technique. This is a ceramic that the people continue doing and using, especially in Española. And this is also a form of house construction that many people continue doing. In fact, or indeed, we have many traditions, many elements present in the Caribbean region connected with indigenous knowledge, indigenous tradition, and also with indigenous resistance. One of the things I finally want to say is, in the case of the Caribbean, the Indian was killed three times: physically, for historiography, and also culturally. This is an example, or live example, of what we need to really do in the future to try to revitalize these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ulloa, for this insightful and engaging presentation. Now, let me introduce you to Professor Stephen Acabado. Professor Stephen Acabado is a professor of anthropology at the University of California in Los Angeles and an advocate for indigenous and community-engaged archaeology. His research examines indigenous histories and landscapes with a focus on Southeast Asia. As the principal investigator of the Ifugao archaeological project, he has challenged colonial era narratives about antiquity of the Ifugao rice terraces, demonstrating their role as a response to Spanish colonization. He also directs the Bicol Archaeological Project and is actively involved in the Taiwan Indigenous Landscape and History Project and the Highland Ecology Project in Morocco. His work emphasizes the agency of indigenous communities in shaping their histories and landscapes, integrating archaeological evidence with local knowledge systems. Acabado is also actively engaged in capacity building efforts and transdisciplinary collaborations that highlight indigenous contributions to environmental and cultural sustainability. Professor Acabado, we are delighted to have you with us. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, sharing at least my work my life's work in the 2 decades, starting in 2003 as part of my master's thesis. Of course, thank you, Enrique. When Enrique sent that invitation, initially I was supposed to say no because I was in Morocco last week, but Enrique said we'll change the date so that you can join us. It's also the first time for me to really use my family name, Acabado, as the last one to present. I'm usually the first one to present. When I'm in a Spanish-speaking crowd, they always ask about why did I get that name. I think it's supposed to be Alabado instead of Acabado, but they miswrote it, and so this is now my name and my kids' family name. But my focus today is similar to my talk today is similar to my family name, Indigeneity, and the problem of indigeneity in the Philippines, because as opposed to the previous talks, we don't have a settler colonial issue. So indigeneity in the Philippines is a product of knowledge production from the Spanish with the archaeological tradition in the Philippines developed by the Americans, and then how the Philippines continued the tradition soon after 1946. So as an archaeologist, following Jorge, unfortunately I don't have the same high resolution data set to show you. Most of my topic here will be from the theoretical application of our findings in Ifugao and in some later, if we have enough time, findings in Bicol, where I'm from. So Philippine archaeology, as I mentioned briefly earlier, started during the Spanish period, although this were mostly treasure hunting, collecting materials for museums in Europe. But it was also the time when the waves of migration theory, which was popularized later by H. Otley Beyer, the American anthropologist chemist who was assigned to the Philippines by the American colonial government uh, to cold, and so most Filipinos are introduced to the concept of waves of migration, which I will talk about later. And so in another talk, I did use the same slide to talk about the development of Philippine archaeology, but it's still, even today, the focus is looking for that pre-Hispanic pure Filipino culture. And in some sense, that's a reaction to the colonial mindset that we need to look for something uniquely and original Filipino. But that has become, again, problematic because that erases and flattens the diversity of the archipelago. There's about more than 7,600 islands, 180 languages, but the focus has always been mostly the Tagalog speakers, the more dominant, if not the Tagalog, more dominant lowland cultures in the Philippines. So, Philippine anthropology, or rather, anthropology and archaeology, was born out of the arrival of the Americans coming in 1898, and then trying to make Filipinos Americans. And so the birth of archaeology in the country was focused on looking for this pre-Hispanic, pre-contact Philippines. So as I already mentioned, that the dominant cultural chronology is this waves of migration theory, where you have the Negritos, the Indonesians, and the Malays coming in successively in waves. And then what that means is that our idea of differences is based on isolation. And that's also one of the explanation used by the Spanish to explain or justify their failure to subjugate cultures who are in the highlands, the Ifugao, and other highland groups in the Cordillera, but they were successful down south with the Lumads. But to explain this failure, they would focus on their isolation, the geography, and the harshness of the environment. And so the United States took over in 1898. Much of what we know about ourselves is based on that shift. The Spanish was demonized by the Philippine educational system, and even today. And one thing about when the United States took over is that they also started this curriculum that we still use today. So the United States wanted the Filipinos to be Americans. They wanted us to celebrate the 4th of July, say the Pledge of Allegiance, and so that curriculum continued on after 1946, because the term Filipino was new. It was used for Spanish born in the Philippines. And it wasn't until the 1860s that Filipino intellectuals co-opted the term to refer to everyone living in the Philippines, whatever color of your skin is, or wherever you came from. So the concept of being Filipino is actually more inclusive than what we know of it today as a reference to those who live in the Philippines. The arrival of the Americans also solidified that idea of indigeneity, because with the 1904 St. Louis Exposition, they showed that colonialism worked, because they brought in about 1,200 to be exact, Filipinos, juxtaposing the Igorots from the Cordillera, a neighboring group from Valle de Fugao, who were practicing all sorts of quote unquote savage practices, dog meat eating every other day, and juxtaposing that with the lowland Filipino constabulary band. So in essence, you're showing that colonialism worked, and then because you have this group of men playing Western instruments, and then these uncolonized people still practicing the pre-civilized practice. So that actually shifted the sentiment of the American public about American annexation of the Philippines, because 1898 the United States was born out of this anti-imperialist movement, but then here they are 100 years later expanding their territories. But they define this in terms of benevolent assimilation and the white man's burden, that they are in the Philippines, in Guam, and in Puerto Rico to help their little brown brothers govern themselves. So that's the foundation of our curriculum today, that sadly hasn't changed, and it has this several layers of colonial baggages. And I've already mentioned the waves of migration model, and it's the Philippine curriculum, the Matatag curriculum, which started a few years ago, shifted to the Austronesian hypothesis, which is, again, Austronesian is not a people, it's not even a language, replacing one colonial model with another one, because again, I think the idea of Austronesian provides this model where you have an intact pre-colonial, pre-Hispanic culture. But it's imagined, it's not real, and I guess it's there now. The challenge for teachers is to use that as some sort of critical thinking for kids, because this is a model, this is not the truth. And then so shifting to the Philippines throughout the Spanish colonial period, there was some sort of invisibility among of the indigenous groups or the local groups, the Indios, because they were either described as non-Christian, and they were or outside of the church, that they're not referred to in their own uh, community names. And then missionization, of course, brought them into the reduction system. And there was a shift when the United States took over, because the United States considered, especially the Cordillera, as a frontier. Most of the administrators that they sent to the Philippines were veterans of the Plains campaigns, and so they some sort of guilt. So they tried to preserve what they encountered in the highlands. And so if you go to the Philippine Cordilleras in Baguio, in Ifugao, in Sagada, nowhere else in the Philippines where you hear country music with men walking around in their cowboy garb without the horses and the cows. But it's because of these um, shift in how they were treated by the colonial overlord. And then, so the Carino versus insular government in 1909 was the foundation of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act that we have now today, uh, um, recognizing access to land by Indigenous peoples. Because up until 1997, with the passage of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, all Indigenous peoples are considered squatters in their own land, because we followed the Regalian doctrine, where anything 18 degrees or above will be any lands would be 18 degrees or above would be government owned, and so they never owned their ancestral domains until 1997. Even today, this is a long process, and so the definition and our understanding of indigeneity in the Philippines is based on this, as I mentioned earlier, this multi-layered knowledge production from the Spanish to the Americans and to the present day Philippine government, especially the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. So the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act would refer to indigenous peoples as this time immemorial, as if we can measure that time immemorial. And so we're trying to work with the Department of Education to at least we can't change this because it's already in the Constitution, but at least try to infuse the local curriculum with local history so that they'll be able to articulate the experiences of each community to the national narrative. And so to go back to this, Spanish colonialism and this idea of highlands as being isolated, most Filipinos think that the highlands and the Ifugao, the Igorots, the Kalinga are uncolonized. In some sense, that became the foundation of the identity of the Ifugao. So when I actually started working in Ifugao and came up with a date for the rice terraces, that the rice terraces are only 400 years old, not 2,000 years old, they were ready to take my head off because that's what they've been told for most of or all of their lives. And so what we came up with, and this is a product of active engagement with the community, is to come up with an explanation on why rice, the shift to rice and the construction of the rice terraces was late. And we said that no, there's no such thing as uncolonized in a colonized setting because saying so is pejorative, is racist, which means that their ancestors never adjusted to the colonial pressures. So I borrowed the term paracolonialism from Native American literary scholars to just again say that they argue that there's no such thing as uncolonized in a colonized setting, and that is supported by the archaeological record. So I'll rush through the some of the again the archaeological data sets here, but just a brief overview of the Spanish history in the Philippines. They were there in 1521, but it wasn't until 1565 that they formally established a colonial administration in Cebu, and that's because of the discovery of the Turno Viaje to Acapulco to Manila to Cebu, actually, galleon trade. And then they moved to Manila later. No one wanted to be in the Philippines because it was too far. There's no gold, but they wanted the Philippines as a staging point to colonize China, Japan, and Cambodia. And when they realized that they couldn't do it, they used the Philippines as a sort of a economic entrepot, bringing goods from Asia to Seville via Acapulco. And so what they'll do is bring all of these goods to Acapulco, bring Filipino tripulantes, crew members to Acapulco, leave the Filipinos there, and then go back with mestizos or Spanish crew members. So there's a 13 generation Filipino community in Acapulco. And if you're interested, I wrote about some of the implications of that they actually brought the technology to distill tequila in Mexico. Because of the production of tuba and lambanog. And so the Philippines was administered by the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So in essence, it was a colony of a colony. So the Philippines is more Mexican than Spanish until 1821 when Spain took over because uh, uh, Mexico gained its independence. So there's a lot of terms now terms in Filipino language: nanay, tatay, palengke, tiangge. There's uh, kamatis and so on. So again, just linking the experiences of this the Western and Eastern Pacific via the Spanish called Empire. So let's see, I have maybe 3 minutes. So the central argument of our work, and I say our because it's not just mine, it's also uh, an interpretation of the community that I work with. Although that my name is there, I don't hold exclusive copyright to what I'm saying here because this is part of this ongoing negotiation with the communities that I work with. And so we look at indigeneity as dynamic. It shifts. Especially now, they don't look at themselves as Filipinos only when they're writing on a formal paper up until the 1970s. Of course, now a lot of the young kids would do. So they use their agency to define who they are. And to move beyond these colonial classifications that we still see today. But these categories have limits because, as I mentioned, it assumes that indigenous peoples are passive. They're just observers of history and not active participants to it. It ignores the diversity of 180 or so groups in the Philippines, and the archaeological work actually challenges. So as I mentioned, pericolonialism suggests that they actively participated in the uh, colonial world, as opposed to what we've been told that they were isolated. So you have all of these findings, and there are archaeological finds there that did show up in this slide. But what the image on the left shows is that there are ceramics that they could have only acquired in the lowland. So they weren't isolated. They were actively trading with lowland groups. It's actually a lot more than what we see in other sites in lowland Philippines. And then, of course, you have beads, and so they were co-opting the economic world of the Spanish to solidify and increase their resources, and both economic and political. And so they were able to resist Spanish attempts at subjugation. The Spanish attempted to subjugate at least the site that I worked in for 12 times, and they were successful one time, but they were repelled right after. So there was no permanent Spanish control up in the highlands. As part of this work is also is this, because they said that the rice terraces are 2,000 years old, according to the American anthropologist. And so there's a big shift in how they understand their history now, that because of our work with the community, they are now infusing the local curricula with the archaeological findings. They get to learn how their ancestors were able to co-opt Spanish aims in the north. And to show that I'm really an archaeologist, I have this excavation profile that clearly shows that rice only appears at about the 1600 layer. Everything else, they're all taro. Uh, and so there are other evidence that show access to European and tradeware ceramics soon after the arrival of the Spanish. So they weren't isolated, as you can see here. And then difference in faunal animal consumption rapid increases, astronomical increases in domesticated pigs, as opposed to deer and hunted deer and wild pigs. So again, there's a shift. So these are just what I mentioned earlier, just to show that we excavated, but they did consolidate their agricultural, their economic and political resources to be able to um, uh, resist Spanish attacks. What that means is because rice cultivation requires a more complex form of social organization, because you need to control the flow of water, control access to land, control access to water, as opposed to other cereals or root crops that you don't need that kind of level of managerial control. And if you translate that into resistance, then you can actually coordinate with other groups because of your uh, more complex socio-political organization. And when the Spanish came to this village, there were 6,000 people, and that's probably a function of rice. In Manila, there were only 2,000 people. So there's also this uh, uh, population um, uh, component. And so you have all of these stuff, the rise of elites for social political organization. They moved to the highlands as an act of resistance that later became accommodation, the intensified agricultural intensification. So here, this could have been constructed within 100 years, not 2,000 years, based on our energetics modeling. And so their engagement was to trade with lowlands and then interact with other groups. And I'm not going to talk about Bicol, but Bicol is another case, very interesting case, because here, using the same framework that we use in Ifugao, what we see in the archaeological record under this church is a negotiated participation, that you still see continuity, as Jorge presented, of materials from 1,000 years ago up until 100 years after Spanish administration. So there was continuity. Yes, they became Catholics, but they were able to maintain their identity amid this Catholic hegemony. And so in Ifugao, it's avoidance, and in Bicol, it's engagement. Ifugao is avoidance and co-optation. And so in the Philippine case, we need to rethink how we use the term indigeneity. I don't want to diminish the experiences of indigenous peoples in the Philippines. They've been marginalized through history. But because of how we teach indigeneity in schools, it reinforces racism against them. Let's see. So I think I will end there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to Dana, to Omar, Jorge, and Stephen for these presentations. I think they touch upon different parts of the world, also different moments in history, and also different approaches and methodologies. And I think that from that alone, I think it's very interesting to how we can explore the experiences of indigenous peoples under colonization from multiple angles. So for those of you who came a little bit late, my name is Enrique Okenve. I'm the Andres Bello Chair here at Espacio de Culturas. And along with me, we're going to have Becky. Becky, you want to introduce yourself, who is going to be also moderating this section with me.
My name is Rebecca Getz. I'm an associate professor of history here at NYU. And I am here primarily because I am a historian of race and slavery in the Atlantic world. And I'm currently finishing a book about enslaved Native people in the Caribbean from the late 15th to late 18th century. So my expertise is primarily on the things that Dana and Jorge were talking about. I know absolutely nothing about Morocco and very little about the Philippines. So I don't really have much commentary to offer with regards to them, but I have some observations that I hope will just help us get the juices flowing a little bit. The first is I think we should have way more panels in which historians and archaeologists are presenting together, because I think that has allowed for some really interesting synergies to develop here, not just between Jorge and Stephen, who are thinking archaeologically about two very different places, but I think that it stimulates historians to think more about continuity than about change, and what does that produce when we are thinking about the long history of Spanish imperialism as a global phenomenon that stretches 400 years, and what happens when we engage with archaeologists. And I think that can be a really productive site of comparison and conversation. Just in thinking in terms of the theme of the panel, which is about the doing and undoing of domination, the first thing that I really noticed was the language of labor relations and forced labor in particular. So just to highlight some of the words that came up: traspaso, depositado, reducción, repartimiento, encomienda, naboría, and then also, of course, rescate into slavery. So I think there's this kind of really complicated way that the Spanish imperial power is imposed on indigenous people as a form of labor relation. And one of the things that I think was coming out in both Jorge and Dana's presentations was that there were so many different words for this, right? And so many different legal categories that Native people might be shunted into. But nevertheless, as Dana points out, the end conclusion is de facto slavery, right? That these people are experiencing a level of exploitation over which they had very little control, and that these legal differences tended to make very little difference in their quotidian lives. And I wonder what kind of conversation we might have about the kind of widespread nature throughout the Spanish imperial world of these kinds of labor relations and exploitative relationships, and what that tells us about both continuity and change over the long term. But the other thing that I noticed, and I think this also came out in Stephen's paper as well, and Omar's to a certain degree as well, is the nature of kind of either forced migration or migration by choice as a means of trying to kind of deal with this imperial situation. And I think, Omar, for you, what stimulated me to think about this was this kind of sense that there's an internal retreat among Moroccans, and that's how they're trying to cope with this situation. So not quite a physical migration, but certainly maybe a mental one, or a spiritual one, and that's, I think, worth thinking about. But there's also this kind of notion of diaspora and reconstitution of community within diaspora, of mobility as both something that is forced on people, but is also a strategy for survival. But even within these kinds of tropes of mobility, there's also the aspect of Native people becoming sedentary, both by force and by choice, as a means of coping with imperial power and domination. But in the end of Jorge's presentation, we have these indigenous villages in Cuba that managed to remain indigenous over 400 years. So clearly being able to either embrace mobility or sedentarism, and enabled indigenous people to reconstitute community, to maintain lines of kinship, and to maintain connection to place in ways that allow for resistance against imperial power. So I think there's a lot here to talk about. And so these are just some of my opening thoughts, and hopefully that can stimulate discussion before we go drink wine and eat food.
All right. I don't know if any of you want to comment on something like that has been said. If you want to elaborate a little bit more on it, I have also some thoughts, but I don't want to take over too much. So I don't know if anybody wants Stephen, or not like Jorge or Dana, if you want to.
I agree that there's needs to be more
Oh,
engagement
yeah.
with historians. And so I actually have a program. We have a program in Southeast Asia, the Program for Early Modern Southeast Asia, where we bring environmental historians, economic historians, and archaeologists to look at, and environmental scientists to look at climate change in the last 1,000 years. And my focus is the last 500 years. But anyway, that's just a side note. But because I, I I wasn't trained as an historical archaeologist. It's by accident. It just so happens that my focus is in Ifugao, which is my interest is agricultural systems, and then their terraces are only 400 years old. And so I was constantly being reminded as an archaeologist, as a graduate student, that we exist to question what the historians wrote about. And so we shouldn't, again, now thinking about it, we should be complementing each other and to work with each other on understanding the past to help us prepare for the future.
Little known secret, I briefly trained as an archaeologist.
Okay. Well, I want to say something about this because this is in my impression, this is one of the main problems that we have, especially in the case of the Caribbean. You know, the historian, is going from one side and the archaeologist is going from another side. You know, we need more, like you mentioned, some more complementary issues. And also, I started my career like historian, and after I entered in the world of archaeology, I think this kind of synergy is really important because one of the most important relevant limitation that we have in the recognition of the indigeneity is the disciplinary boundaries. Historians have specific sources, archaeologists have a specific sources, but we don't have really a synergy, and also another thing is the microhistory. Like Dan, I like a lot your presentation because it's like a microhistory. The majority of us we talk about in general, and she's talking about a specific history. And also, I have a comment about your paper because I saw the same case in the case of Cuba. For example, in the Cuban cases, in 19th century, the Spaniard also moved people from Yucatan to Cuba. And also they have, for substitute this black slave, was in Cuba. And also they have, and this is another chapter on the indigeneity in Cuba. And also we have the legacy of that people in the Cuban indigeneity too. The people mentioned like in the 19th century and 20th century, they mentioned like Huachinangos. And they create a community in near to Havana. We have legacy of that people. Indigeneity is very complex, dynamic, and also diverse.
Yeah, Dana, I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, because one of the challenges that say archaeologists, but also historians, oftentimes we are accused of like, oh, it's too abstract. Who are you talking about? Even when we mention, oh, I'm talking about this community of these people. Yeah, but who are these? Who are the men and the women? And Dana actually brought the women. I mean, she gave us the names, and I just wonder how these tell us perhaps a different story about the experiences of these indigenous people.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I am an empiricist, which is not sometimes very popular, but so I mean that just means I give primacy to the archive. And well, I think it's I consider myself an early modern historian, and I really believe that actually the early modern story is a story about the local intention with the empire, with the imperial, right? So it's what is the imperial narrative, but then actually what is really happening on the ground. And I think that the empirical approach is the only kind of way to really kind of get what's happening on the ground. And so I think going back to what you were saying, Rebecca, is that it's only when you get into these archives and these documents that you can really like recover some of these people and see the kind of their responses to colonial rule, right? And I think for initially when I started this project because I was interested in it, came out of my first book project, which looked at how immigrant native peoples come to these mining towns and reconstitute their communities. But then I saw how the autochthonous people there got caught up in this kind of colonial war. And then as I started to go through the documentation, I was able to see, if only in fragments, if only in brief minutes, right, moments, their life experiences. And I just wanted to go back to this notion of the labor. I think that part of what this is revealing is that forced labor was just really, there were so many manifestations of forced labor, and they were very much often local. So there's these broader labor categories you were all gesturing to, the repartimiento, the encomienda. But then at the local level, there were all sorts of other labors, forms of forced labor that went by these different terms, right? And so I think for this project in particular has been very challenging, because I often have people who don't have names. So if you, at one point in time in the piece, if you submitted to the Spanish state but still refused to be Christianized, they wouldn't allow you to take a name. They would call you India Barbara, Indio Barbaro, right? The barber, the savage, right? Because you wouldn't take a Christian name, right? And so I think it's just really interesting to try to kind of put all this together and see not only how labor and mobility shaped people's lives, but also then to try to get back to the archive, to try to figure out who these people are under these archival conditions. So I think the only way to do it is to like try to highlight individual cases when you can, try to provide as much information as you can, but then in a way you're kind of telling a longer story that's the combined stories of many people. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I'm just because I know this is getting late, and I want to open the floor to questions and comments. I just wanted to say, bring things a little bit closer to home, to my home in a way, and get Omar involved in this, because I think you look at this from a different angle. You're not a historian, you're not an archaeologist, but you still are able to speak to these experiences, and I think what was very interesting to me is this notion of representation, right? These are words, these are images sometimes, and okay, they are not policies, but you show that they have power, and people are also resistant against these representations, I guess, because of the power that they have. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about it, also in the context of Morocco, where we see, at the very least, two different local / indigenous identities, right? And I think maybe you can say a little bit more about it. So you talk about the Arab or Moroccans, and then you talk about the Amazigh, right? And it makes me think, sometimes we teach about African history, and when we teach about these experiences of the expansion of Islam in other areas of Africa, we talk about, okay, what we have here is Islamization without Arabization. North Africa is Arabization and Islamization, and I think your example shows that is not the case, right? And I also wonder how the presence of these two different Moroccans affected Spanish representations of the local people.
Thank you so much, Enrique. It's a great observation, and just to contribute to the discussion, indeed, sometimes I see things also differently, and I feel lucky because I am also an Arabic speaker, so I have also the privilege of accessing the tools and the documents written and the narratives written by, speakers of Arabic and Arabic tongue. And that also allows me to see different dynamic and perspective, not only from within, but also about the other, right? Starting from the basic dichotomy of like the infidel and the faithful, like this dynamic between like Moors and Christians, or just the dynamic between how, like, even within Morocco, there is a lot of like separation and language and linguistic like registers that also tells a different story and different background based on the tribal location of a certain group. And Morocco is so diverse, and it's also interesting to explore this kind of representations inside Morocco and see how it's also being a little bit manipulated through an elite circle of people who has also the privilege of writing. So this practice of writing exerts some influence on how the information is being circulated and also used and misused sometimes. And also from the perspective of the Moroccans who were also exposed. I mean, I'm talking about the elites, young nationalists who were privileged to go, for example, to Egypt to study there or to go to Paris. So their information and their education was also crucial in how they were perceiving the interaction with colonial powers or with Britain or with France vis-a-vis the tensions inside Morocco, because there was even between the nationalists this huge um, um, contrast between shall we like break totally with French policies of dividing the Moroccan society into Arabs, Moors, and then Amazigh people, or shall we adhere to a pan-Islamism that unifies everything within one Islamic context? And these dynamics are interesting because we see expressions of these narratives from Spain as a rhetoric of, okay, we are like brothers in blood, and we are here, for example, in Spain as a continuous expression of this brotherhood, because in the past we shared the same ancestors, and we are here just like trying to continue the same legacy, but with a little bit of subordination, because we are a little bit better, and if you guys like, cooperate with us, we can regenerate you. But those who don't, they are doomed, for example. And from the Moroccan perspective, is also interesting because sometimes you can see the BS is of the narrative, and sometimes you are just being pragmatic, and because you are under the duress of nature, there is like no resources, and if you've been bombarded like for a couple of years and the land it's not fertile, you have to survive and you have to feed your family. So if the mobility within the context of like moving and looking for a region with a greener grass, I can even go, or a native can simply go to be a soldier in the civil war, and that also justified the motivations and why, for example, they showed this a degree of pragmatism and participating in the Spanish Civil War, for instance, or who just like supported the institution of the medical institutions in Morocco, or they served some of the medical agendas in Morocco. Just to elaborate on your example.
All right, thank you. Becky, I don't know if you have anything or.
I think we should see
yeah,
what the audience has to say.
So, yeah, we have a question there at the back.
So actually, I really appreciate, Omar, the point that you brought up, right? Because I was going to bring up an earlier question about religion in particular, and how like in the Spanish colonial context, the Catholic Church is both a technology of economization, as in labor, right? Like policy servicios and like other kinds of forced labor, right? But also of racialization, right? And so one of the things that I found in my work in the Philippines and indigeneity is that there too, like in the Moroccan case, they make in the 18th century colonial documents, they make a distinction between indio and infiel. So they actually do this kind of like partitioning between like Christianized indigeneity, which is then ripe for deracination and de-indigenization into migrant labor, right? And then infiel, which is that kind of untouched, right? The racialization of untouchedness. So I really appreciate that. My question was actually going to be about indigeneity and diaspora, and this is a thread that I think I want to pick up on Becky's comments, but especially Dana, your amazing presentation. Those in generally, I think in North American historiography, the fields of indigenous studies, indigenous history, and histories of migration don't talk to each other, right? And part of that is that the fundamental paradigm of the history of migration is a liberal and almost a demographic one, right? One has choice, or one has coercion, or one is displaced into from point A to point B, and the history of migration begins upon arrival to point B, right? From home to host country, right? But what we don't often do enough, what I don't often see enough, in especially in Native American history and histories of indigeneity in East and Southeast Asia, is these processes of reducción, of policy servicios, of forced labor, of displacement, right? The Trail of Tears, for example, in the North American case, these are processes of diaspora formation, right? And so across all your contexts in your fields, in the context of, I think, thinking comparatively in the colonial Spanish Empire case, what is germane to your context and the cross context that that might get us to think or rethink about the conversations that frame and insist indigenous people as always out of time and migrants as always out of place. Because they're both, right? Indigeneity doesn't go away when you're on the move or forced out of your home, right? Or return to your home. So I'll just offer that as a point of reflection. Thank you.
Well, I think just to offer one example. I mean, I've had people tell me that because the native peoples who are basically being removed throughout the viceroyalty because there's not a sufficient number of them, or they don't develop enough of a cultural group that this is not a diaspora. So so there's that argument. The other thing that I would say is that there is I said in the talk that I think these are the first Native American reservations in the Americas, because they're not missions. So what happens is after the peace, basically peace talks come. One of the ways the Spanish states gets that, and I was curious about this context here, is they'll say, if you lay down your arms, we will give you some land to settle on, and then we will give you the elements of sedentary life, the things that you need, needles and threads and blankets, right? And they call these reducciones, and this is a word that's used throughout the Spanish America. But in this case, it's very specific, right? It's not a mission. It's not being controlled by friars. It's native peoples coming together. And so Native peoples from all different ethnic groups come here to form and try to reorganize. So I always call it an opportunity for reorganization, right? Because people would just say immediately, well, this is a mission system. So I guess what I'm saying is, right, I think with this project, I'm trying to rethink what diaspora means. Like there's like how, maybe expand that, because maybe that word is has a lot of presentist moment, meaning to it. And then also to say like, yeah, this goes back to Ricky. What you're saying is like, yes, like these are really oppressive conditions, but where can we find moments where we can see where Native peoples are acting in their interest? And so then I think these communities that appear during the peace that are composed by Native peoples of all different ethnicities, I see these as opportunities for reconstitution and reorganization, and I see Indigenous women playing a huge role in reconstituting them. So I don't see them so much, right? So has like moments of surrender and the Spanish bringing of civilization. I see that. So I guess I have been looking at the British North America, Dutch North America literature on this concept of diaspora, but I think that as I work through the project, I'm trying to rethink what this means, and what it and this goes back again to like how important the local context means. What does this mean in this moment, in this period for these people? So you ask a great and complicated question. That's just kind of my quick answer to it.
Can I jump in on that? I think a lot of the things you're pointing to, Adrienne, have to do with, especially in the United States, the politics around federal recognition, right? Where acknowledgement of migration, whether forced or by choice, where acknowledgement of coalescence and reorganization it gets difficult because of the way that federal recognition acts around racial purity issues, right? And so I think that because of that, there's a lot less conversation about a concept like diaspora, and there's a lot less conversation around coalescence and reorganization, and I think that kind of damages the ways we can talk about Indigenous resistance and resilience in kind of fundamental ways.
Can I just say something about that really quickly? So this is just exactly so I literally this 3 months ago got asked by a group of people in the San Luis Potosi area, basically saying they're Chichimeca and asking me if I had any literature for them, because they were taking it to the Mexican government because they wanted to be recognized as a group. So anyway, just wanted to throw that in just to say that, yeah.
I mean, and I think we see this in the Caribbean too, with Tainos, with Taino-ness and, like descendant communities and how to categorize them. And Stephen, I think you were speaking about this quite a bit when you were talking about, that kind of pure pre-Hispanic mythological past and the attachment to it. And so that a lot of the ways that we, and I'm using the royal we here to talk about the Americas in general, the way that we speak about indigeneity, and the way that in the United States, and it sounds like in Mexico also, although I don't know anything about that, that kind of, you have to prove this kind of documented lineage to this pure pre-colonial past, that's kind of very suppressive of acknowledging complex histories and indigenous agency.
In Taiwan too, I think it's the same. You have indigenous. They know their descendants, but they lost the language and they don't get recognized.
Well, so now it's not real, right? And so yeah.
I want to say something about that. The indigenous mobility was really an important factor for resistance, in the past, also in the colonial times. And also in the case of the Caribbean, after the encomienda system, the people like you mentioned in the mobility of the indigenous people was a form of resistance and reorganization. They created, community in isolation, sometimes with a real, far or really far to the colonial center, like for example Yateras or in the eastern part of Cuba. They continue also recreation or with many tradition there, but also in the case of the indigeneity, for example, in the Caribbean today, I think that you mentioned we have many debates because some people, basically the academic people, reclaim what is the proof you are really Taino, what is the proof you are really connected with this past, We have many discussion about that. But the thing is, this is a form of the indigeneity, like a racial or pure indigeneity. But another thing is you have the indigeneity like a dynamic for resistance, the more political and also social organization form to reclaim, to try to connect with the ancestor or this part of your ancestor. This is two different points or different part of the indigeneity. If you thinking indigeneity only like, racial or pure connection, like here, for example, or some academic thinking, you lost this kind of another side of indigeneity,
Yes. Question over there? Yes. No, Rizzo, yeah.
Thank you very much for this fantastic panel. I want to go back to the concept of continuity that Rebecca just provoked us in terms like the logic of colonialism, the settler colonialism is a continuity that's going on in multiple ways, and not in the way how we, for example, see nowadays since the 20th century, 19th century, with the new state formations in Latin America and the Caribbean. What Steve mentioned, mestizaje, and I would like, if we can, perhaps think about also how that logic of colonialism is very much present in this ideology of mestizaje, and how the indigenous presence and resistance is also kind of challenging that homogeneous and dominant narrative in I don't know if, I know just Steve mentioned the concept mestizaje, and I don't know how this is operate in the Philippine state, but I'm thinking, as a historian from Latin America, and I feel like that's the same debate as just Jorge mentions about, this conception of indigeneity from very essential static visions. That's very, very high, component of racialization as well, right? And embracing this mestizaje, it's also a project that denies and erases indigenous presence in the way how, yes, Jorge mentioned, not only physically, historiographically, but also culturally, and as going on in this pattern institutionalized, right? And so I think it's I guess it can be beneficial to bring the reflections in that process as well of the mestizaje.
I can try. In the Philippines, the mestizo concept, it's not just Spanish and local populations. We also have Chinese families, but if you flip the coin, you also see this kind of sort of prejudice among indigenous groups who would have like half blood. I've heard some Ifugao, some friends make fun of someone who's not pure Ifugao. So that's, in some sense, it's either because of that idea of isolation and being, they laugh at us lowlanders for being under the Spanish, and they were able to resist colonialism. And so that's just one. And then I think I would have to correct myself about the Philippines not having a settler colonial issue. We have in Mindanao because of migration. Most of them are from, or the diaspora from Visayas and Luzon. So you have Ilonggo speakers in Mindanao, for example, because they were brought there by the national government. So it's again maybe a more contemporary form of settler colonialism.
I want to say, this idea of mixture of racial democracy is a form also to a negation of, obnubilate many group, many social group and ethnic group. In Latin America, it's very common. The idea of the formation of, national identity is some kind of reductionist in this way. And also is this kind of mechanism was also colonial, was used by the Spaniard, for example. In the case of the Caribbean, you have in 19th century, they won the land that people, have. And they say, okay, you are not Indian anymore. You are not indigenous anymore because you are mixed or you are mestizos or you are white or you are, this idea of, racial democracy was a colonial idea and also continue today. If you analyze, for example, like Stephen mentioned in the Philippines, when I hear you, I was thinking in the case of the Caribbean, especially in the case of Cuba, many of the American anthropologists, when they arrived to Cuba in the beginning of the 20th century, they think, we don't have indigenous people here because they are all mixed, because it was some kind of connection, direct connection with the race and culture. You are not Indians, you are not you are not connected directly with these people, you are not, indigenous. And this is function for the Spaniard and also function for anthropologists at the beginning of the 20th century, and also function today, like you mentioned, in some cases.
Omar, briefly, please.
Briefly, yeah. The idea of mestizaje or miscegenation, I find it very interesting, especially how it was deployed not only in the official discourse of Spanish colonialism, but also in the rearticulation of contemporary series like the one that I shared. Just to share a brief example, one of the characters called Larbi, so he's an Amazigh from Al-Husima from North Morocco, who is serving a Spanish medical institution as someone who can help, right? Long story short, so he developed a love affair with one of the nurses, and all the family and all the odds are against him to have this relationship with that nurse. But here's the interesting contradiction. Like, from within the Spanish colonial discourse, the nurse is seen as an actor to improve or to regenerate the other through the transmission of Spanish blood, but only for a selective number of Moroccans. It's like a cherry picking dynamic. Only those who are considered noble or have this inclination to cooperate with Spain or who can advance Spanish agenda. The other flip of the contradictory is that, like, officially existed in Morocco and in Tetuan, this institution called DAI, Delegación de Asuntos Indígenas, Delegation of Indigenous Affairs, with the only goal of protecting and asserting control and supervision of these mixed relationships. And it's interesting because Muslims were considered indigenous while Moroccan Jews were not considered indigenous. And this makes me think as a connection of this, who is indigenous or who is like connected to Iberia pre-Hispano-Moroccan War. If we are talking about Moriscos or if we are talking about Sephardiyas. And then we can transition to another like topic of like, well, the Jews were like polyglots, or they also contributed to advancing colonial agenda with trans-regional networking, while, for example, Muslims, although they were considered also Moriscos from the past Iberian legacy, they were not considered such. So this mestizaje is interesting because sometimes if it serves the agenda, we can do it. If not, it's considered like una mancha that harms the Spanish imperial reputation.
Yeah, the social categorization and racial categorization coming again.
Mm-hmm. I think I don't know if there's any more questions. We only had time for one, but I also reminded you that tomorrow we're meeting again. So you can think, I mean, there was plenty of food for thought. Yes. There's going to be food now as well. But I mean, and I think perhaps you can also think about some of these ideas, because tomorrow we'll have a more dynamic section, and we'll interject throughout the discussions. We'll interject interact with the members of the audience, and then you can ask your questions. So I think we can leave it here and just go outside and enjoy ourselves. Not that we have not enjoyed ourselves now, but I mean, continue enjoying ourselves. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you very much to all of you.